We've been talking about the Qur'an, and in this lecture we're going to take a look at contradictions and errors in the Qur'an and the doctrine of abrogation. Now, the Qur'an, again, is, according to Muslims, directly from Allah. It's free from all error, and in fact, I quote from one Muslim, al-Athari, who says that faithful Muslims are to regard as an unbeliever anyone who denies a single letter of the Quran or who adds anything to it. The Quran itself says in Surah 4, verse 82, "Do they not consider the Quran carefully? Had it been from anyone other than Allah, they would surely have found in it many contradictions." So the Quran itself is saying here in Surah 4, verse 82, if there are many contradictions in the Quran, that proves that it is not from Allah. Well, the fact of the matter is, and I list in a resource list called Contradictions in the Quran, which lists over 120 internal contradictions alone, as well as multiple historic, scientific, factual, grammatical, and biblical errors. These include big ones and small ones. Let me just mention a few. First of all, what is Satan? In some surahs, he's described as an angel, but in Surah 66, in Surah 18, he's described as a jinn. Are Christians friends or foes? Well, Surah 5, verse 82 says that strongest among men in enmity to the believers, you will find the Jews and the pagans. But nearest among them in love to the believers, you will find those who say, we are Christians. But just the opposite is said in Surah 5, verse 51, which says, O you who believe, do not take Jews and Christians for your friends and protectors. And in Surah 98, it says that Jews and Christians are the worst of creatures. Direct contradictions. What's the food in hell? Well, Surah 69 says that, regarding the people in hell, nor any food except filth from the washing of wounds. But contradicting that, Surah 88 verse 6 says, no food will there be for them, but a poisonous thorny plant. So, what is it? Well, again, these are frank contradictions. What was man created from? Well, in Surah 96, it says that man was created from a clot, a piece of thick coagulated blood. But from Surah 16, it says he created man from a drop of sperm. Surah 25 says he created man from water. Surah 15 says we created man from sounding clay of altered black smooth mud. Surah 30 says that he created man from dust. And in Surah 19 it says, we created man out of nothing. So what is it? These all contradict each other. And which was created first, heaven or earth? Surah 2 verse 29 says, he created for you all of that which is on the earth. Then he directed himself to the heaven and made them 7 heavens. But Surah 79 says that, are you more difficult creation or is heaven? Allah constructed it. He raised its ceiling and proportioned it, and he darkened its night and extracted its brightness. And after that, he spread the earth. Again, these are frank, direct contradictions. In addition to that, the Quran contains multiple errors. Now, I list a couple of resources dealing with the Quran and science and history, but simple things. Remember, Muhammad was a 7th century, basically uneducated Arab. So, where does the sun set? In Surah 18, it gives a story of this person and says, and we followed him till when he reached the setting place of the sun, he found it setting in a muddy spring. Now, even a school child knows that the sun does not set in a muddy spring. It's a vast star out in the heavens. Now, in Surah 17, verse 1, it talks about the exalted God who took Muhammad one night for a visit from the sacred mosque in Mecca to the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. The problem is, as one author points out, there was no mosque in Jerusalem at that time. The mosque, the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, originally was a small prayer house erected by Umar, the second caliph. But even that was not begun until several years after Muhammad had died. What about sperm and the development of fetal development? Surah 16 verse 4 says that he created man from a drop of sperm. But Surah 86 verses 5 through 7 said he's created from a drop of sperm proceeding from between the backbone and the ribs. No, I'm sorry. Sperm does not come from your back, between the backbone and the ribs. Furthermore, Surah 96 talks about having been created out of a clot of congealed blood. Well, this one physician points out, as a matter of scientific fact, there is no stage as a clot during the development of a fetus. And so these are just frank errors, because Muhammad didn't know any better. The Qur'an on more than one occasion says that it simply confirms what was in the Bible. In fact, Surah 5 verse 48 says that we sent the Qur'an confirming the scripture that came before it and guarding it in safety. Well, we've already seen multiple biblical errors in the Qur'an. For example, the claim that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was the sister of Moses, the denial of the crucifixion, the denial of the resurrection, the denial that Jesus is the Son of God, and the claim that Muhammad is prophesied in the Bible. These are all false. In your book, I list a few other things. For example, according to Genesis, Abraham's father was named Terah. According to the Quran, Surah 6, verse 74, says his name was Azar. In Exodus, Moses was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. According to the Quran, Moses was adopted by Pharaoh and his wife. Now, this is important because the Bible came first, and the Quran appeals to its consistency between it and the Bible as verification that the Quran also is from God. Logically, therefore, if the two contradict each other, then it is the Quran, not the Bible, that is in error, because the Quran is simply claiming to confirm what already was in the Bible. There's an important implication of this. If the Quran is not straightforward and correct about earthly things that can be verified, how can anybody trust it when it says things that cannot be verified? And these contradictions and errors prove, even according to the Quran itself, the challenge that it made in Surah 4, verse 82, prove that the Quran cannot be from God. Now, how do Muslims try to get around that? Well, one thing they do is what is known as the Doctrine of Abrogation. The Doctrine of Abrogation basically is that if two verses in the Quran contradict each other, then the one that was revealed to Muhammad later in time abrogates or supersedes the earlier one. That's one reason why we have Appendix A, because it shows the order in which Muhammad received the verses of the Quran. And just for example, the first one he received was Surah 96. The next to the last one he received is Surah 9. Okay, so we're going to see why that's important in just a minute. Now, the doctrine of abrogation creates big problems for Muslims. First of all, the doctrine of abrogation implicitly recognizes that the Quran does contain errors. But that contradicts the fact that the Quran says there are none that can alter the words and decrees of Allah, and none can change his words. So the doctrine of abrogation contradicts those who say that Allah's word cannot be changed. So this goes directly to Allah's credibility and reliability. Furthermore, the doctrine of abrogation undermines the claim that the Qur'an is the very word of Allah and is eternal. How could it exist eternally on a tablet in heaven if it contains abrogated passages? Further, the doctrine of abrogation renders the Qur'an largely unintelligible. Why is that? There's one, I list in your book, multiple hadiths, list verses or parts of verses that have been abrogated. Now, there is a former Muslim named Anwarul Haq. He has a book called Abrogation in the Qur'an. He lists 250 verses that have been abrogated, and he lists the verses that abrogate them. Now, so another source says that out of the 114 surahs of the Qur'an, there are only 43 that have not been affected by the doctrine of abrogation, which means that the majority of the surahs involve abrogated passages. Now, there's a huge problem here because there is no uniform list of these verses have been abrogated and these are the ones that do the abrogation. So how do you know which ones are abrogated and which are not? Furthermore, most all of the abrogated passages are still in the Quran. So this is a huge problem for Muslims because they are supposed to obey what the Quran commands and not do what it forbids. And yet, how do I know? Has this been abrogated or not? You see? So that's one reason why Muslims can have no assurance of their salvation, because they don't even know if they're obeying the Quran or which verses of the Quran are valid today. But there's an even bigger problem. The doctrine of abrogation has serious implications for anybody who claims that Islam is the religion of peace. Why? Because Surah 9, the next to the last surah given by Muhammad, it contains verse 5, is what's known as the sword verse, which says that fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, seize them, beleaguer them, lie in wait for them. And Surah 9 verse 29 is called the fighting verse, which says, fight those who do not believe in Allah or the last day, and so on. Now, there's an Islamic professor named Mahmoud Ayub. He points out that Surah 9, which contains the sword verse and the fighting verse, was one of the last surahs to be revealed. And it defines once and for all the relations between the firmly established community of Muslims and their non-Muslim subjects. Jurists have therefore taken the laws enunciated in Surah 9 to abrogate all previous injunctions. And so, in one source that I quote, it says that 113 verses are abrogated by the sword verse and 9 verses are abrogated by the fighting verse. And, you know, a Western Muslim, Yahya Imrich, twice in his book on Islam, he quotes a passage that says, there's no compulsion in religion, and so on. But that was from an early surah. He never mentions that that surah has been abrogated. In fact, what this means is that virtually all of the peace and tolerance verses in the Quran have been abrogated. They are no longer in effect at all, which means that people like ISIS and Islamic terrorists are absolutely correct when they justify their terrorism by quoting the Quran. This is important and dangerous material, but it shows why we need to be able to talk with Muslims before they learn what their religion really teaches. Another problem with the doctrine of abrogation is that some Muslims say that the Quran abrogated all the prior books, like the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Psalms, and so on. That's not true, because we've already seen in the Quran, it validates the Bible. Muhammad looked up to it, and he's told to consult it and believe it, and so on and so forth. And so the only verses in the Quran that talk about abrogation talk about abrogating different verses in the Quran. It never says not that the Bible has been abrogated. But there's something even stranger. Apparently, Muhammad's own life, the hadith, his sunnah, can abrogate and supersede the Qur'an itself. Because the Qur'an as it exists today does not call for stoning to death for adultery. Yet the hadith reveals that Muhammad called for stoning and carried out stoning as a punishment for adultery. And some Muslim countries follow this practice today. And so if Muhammad's life and the hadith can supersede the Quran, then how can anybody know what they are to believe and do? Because the hadith are a series of books that long. It makes the practice of Islam impossible to know, am I doing the right thing or am I not doing the right thing? So let me conclude this by saying this. The Bible tells a coherent story, beginning with the creation in the garden, the fall of man into sin, God's plan of redemption, ultimately through Jesus Christ, and ending with the new heaven and the new earth, the new creation. And the Bible is like a little library consisting of 66 books that all tell the same story. And they're different genres, so Bible scholars, you need to know what kind of book you're reading, where in redemptive history is it, and so on and so forth. Muslims do not look at the Quran that way at all, because the Quran is not a history. The surahs it does not tell a story. It's basically a book of instruction. You need to do this, and don't do that, and don't ask any questions. We talked earlier about the Muslim doctrine of bid'ah, or innovation, and which basically threatens one with hell. This means that the Sharia law, which is based upon the Quran and the Hadith, leaves no room for modernization or flexibility. It basically locks in practices from 7th century Arabia. Because of the doctrine of abrogation, it enshrines Surah 9, the most warlike, intolerant practices, because that was the last one, or next to the last one given. We need to know something. The issue, as I've said before, is not Muslims. Most Muslims, as they exist, and you may know them, are pretty much like us. They want to be successful, they want the best for their kids, and so on and so forth. The problem is Islam and the Quran itself. And until the Quran is fundamentally reevaluated, reinterpreted, and reapplied within Islam, there will be no peace in the world. Unfortunately, from what we see, I think the chances of that happening are very small. But that's why we need to know these things, so that we can talk winsomely, truthfully, biblically with Muslims, point them to the one place they will find the peace that they seek, and that is in Jesus Christ. And so, in the next couple of lectures, as we conclude this course, we will be talking about chapter 6 and trying to bridge the divide between Islam and the gospel, primarily by using the Quran and Islamic practices themselves.